Hi everybody and welcome to today's webinar. I'm David Wynn, the Head of Client Services at Greenstone. I'd like to welcome you today to our half-an-hour webinar on CDP Reporting 2017, What You Need to Know. I'm joined today by Sarah Robertson from CDP, and we're going to be taking you through some tips and guidance for reporting this year, and then take a longer look to some reporting for 2018. So for today's session, what I'm going to do is first off hand over to Sarah, and she's going to be taking you through a little bit of background on CDP for those that aren't as familiar, and then highlighting some of the key things that have changed this year for the 2017 reporting. So a lot of organizations are in the midst of responding at the moment, so she'll take you through what some of those key changes are. She'll then talk a little bit about reimagining disclosure, which is CDP's project that's underway at the moment for next year in terms of looking at how disclosure will change. And then finally, I'll round off the session today with a few tips on improving your score and your response, and draw from some of the experiences of organizations. So in GoToWebinar, we've got quite a number of people on the session today. That said, please, using the GoToWebinar, do send through any questions. So as we go through, if you think of any questions or would like to ask anything, please send those through. We'll be putting the questions and all the responses together into an FAQ document and circulating that around to people. If there are company-specific questions that you have that you want a direct answer to, then again, please do use the question functionality in GoToWebinar, and Sarah and I will get back to you with any responses. Great, so what I'm going to do is just hand over now to Sarah, who's going to take us through the first part of this presentation today.
Great, thanks David, and hi everyone, thanks very much for joining. So just to kick off then, for those of you slightly unfamiliar with CDP, we launched in 2000. I'm just going to move on to the next slide if I can. There we go, perfect. So we're the only global system for companies as well as cities to basically measure, disclose, manage and share environmental information. So we ask companies, cities, as well as states and regions for data on their environmental performance. And then we transform that data into detailed analysis on critical environmental risks, opportunities and impacts, so that investors, businesses and policymakers can use our data and our insights to make better decisions when it comes to investment and to manage risk and capitalize on opportunities. In 2016, we had over 5,600 companies respond to our climate change, water and forest requests. We also had 533 cities disclosed, as well as 71 states and regions. And the request for this information was sent out on behalf of 827 institutional investors with around 100 trillion US dollars worth of assets, as well as 89 supply chain members, and they represent a combined purchasing power of over 2 trillion US dollars. Once we have our company data submitted to us, we score these, and each grade falls into one of 4 levels that represents a company's journey towards leadership. So starting from the bottom, disclosure really reflects the completeness of a company's response. Awareness reflects the extent to which the company has assessed environmental issues, risks and impacts and how that relates to their business. Management is really the extent to which the company has implemented actions, policies and strategies to address those environmental issues. And then leadership, it looks for particular steps a company has taken, which represents what we consider to be best practice in the field of environmental management. And you can find our data in various places, such as on the Bloomberg terminal, in MSCI and True Cost reports, and on Google Finance. In terms of the disclosure cycle, this runs broadly from the beginning of February to the end of June. And this year, the deadline for disclosure for investor submissions is the 29th of June, and that's for climate, water, and forests. And if you're asked to disclose by one or more of your customers, the deadline for this is the 31st of July. So moving swiftly on to the changes that we made for 2017, these are minor and actually only apply to the climate change questionnaire. So there were no changes made to forest and water, which I'm sure you're pleased to hear. In terms of climate change, though, for 2017, this, if you're disclosed before, you'll recognize as the structure of the questionnaire. It's broken down broadly into 3 main sections. So that's management, risks and opportunities, and emissions, and then with a sign-off page. The management section covers governance and strategy, targets and initiatives, and communication. And that's intended on capturing the sort of governance structure of your company with regards to climate change. Targets and initiatives focuses on those initiatives that you have in place to reduce your emissions derived from your direct and indirect activities. And communication asks about whether you communicate your position on climate change and your GHG emissions beyond your CDP disclosure. Risks and opportunities covers obviously the risks and opportunities related to climate change and in particular your management of those. And then in the emissions section, this covers a variety of things, including your direct and indirect emissions data, but as well your emissions performance with regards to emissions intensity and emissions reductions. In terms of the changes we made then for the 2017 disclosure cycle, the light grey boxes have not been changed, these sections have not been changed. Minor changes have been introduced to some questions in the sections highlighted in dark grey, and then slightly more moderate changes have been made to the sections identified in dark red. So I'm going to focus on the changes that have been made in dark grey and dark red. So the first thing to note is in question 2.2, so this is where you disclose how climate change is integrated into the business strategy and the outcome of that process. We have updated the guidance to ask companies to include 2 further bits of information. One is their stance on the Paris Agreement and whether it's influenced the company's business strategy. And the other is really in CDP's commitment to align with the TCFD recommendations. We ask companies to report on whether they're using forward-looking scenario analysis. Because these are 2 new introductions, these are not scored this year, but I'm sure you agree they will capture hopefully some rather interesting information. And when I come on to talk about reimagining disclosure and how we're aligning with the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, this new introduction should make a lot more sense as well. The second change I want to talk about is around Scope 2. So providing 2 Scope 2 figures has really become standard practice since the release of the GHG Protocol's Scope 2 guidance last year. So CDP now asks companies to disclose their approach to reporting Scope 2 emissions. So whether they report location and or market base. And this is different from last year where we just asked whether companies have operations in markets that provide supplier-specific data in the form of contractual instruments. So the purpose of this change in this question is for a company to disclose whether they are reporting a market-based figure, and if they're not, why that's the case. At this stage, we're only scoring companies for providing 1 Scope 2 figure, but as I said before, providing these 2 figures is considered to be best practice. We have a lot of guidance on this on our website if you need some assistance on understanding the difference between these 2 approaches and why the market-based approach is considered to be more accurate. Then the next change is in 14.4b. So this is around your engagement with suppliers. Previously, we just asked about the proportion of the number of suppliers you engage with, and then the proportion of procurement spend that represents. This year, we have broadened the question to include types of engagement as well. So this new table allows companies to disclose the type of engagement they're using with their suppliers, as well as the number of suppliers and the proportion of spend, and also, and probably most importantly, really the impact of that engagement. So those are two additional columns added to that question there. And again, those are just scored for providing any information. So in terms of changes to scoring, just to reiterate, we do have a fully transparent scoring methodology on our website, and this provides details of the points available per question and the criteria that you need to be met to be awarded those points, so do check that out. And the scoring itself is conducted by our scoring partners. Our primary partner for this is ADEC. And here are those 4 levels again, which represent the company's journey towards being a good environmental steward. And we think that the score gives a clear picture of what a company's current level is with respect to environmental stewardship and what action to focus on next. The scores are initially calculated as a percentage for each level. So the number of points achieved is then divided by the number of points which could have been achieved, so the number of points available, and then multiplied by 100. And a minimum score threshold must be achieved on one level before the company will then be scored on the next level. So these thresholds that you can see on this slide have provisionally been set, but they will be reviewed during the scoring process. And we think this approach incentivizes completeness in reporting, because obviously you can't move on to the awareness level without having comprehensive enough disclosure or enough information to actually assess awareness on. We also think it incentivizes action based on the assessment of risks and impacts, and it incentivizes consistent progress across different areas. So the final score that you will receive is based on the score in the highest level of the 4 levels, the highest score in the 4 levels that you've achieved. So in terms of which areas to potentially focus on, if you are mature in reporting and you're looking at where the leadership points lie, here is that breakdown. So you can see strategy is very key. We want to drive companies to have board level oversight, to have monetary incentives for the management of climate change, for this topic to be integrated into the business strategy, and to consider how your business is going to evolve towards a low carbon economy. And targets and initiatives is another important one. We want to encourage companies to set long-term ambitious targets that are in line with a 2-degree pathway. But more details on the scoring can be found in our methodology. Here are a list of, again, very minor tweaks to the scoring methodology. The ones in red I'm going to talk about now. So in 3.3a and b, this is where you report if you have emission reduction targets, intensity or absolute. And there's an option to select whether the target is science-based, if it's not, whether you plan to set one in a couple of years. And basically there are now points available for selecting that any of these options on this slide, basically, apart from there's half a point less if you say that there's no established methodology. Again, we want to encourage companies to at least commit to setting one and to work with the initiative on developing relevant methodologies. The next thing is so this is just the management points available for targets. So there's basically there's a few things you need to cover in your targets. They need to be medium term, so that's 2020 to 2035. At least 70% of your emissions must be within the scope of the targets, and there must be no relevant exclusions. And for leadership, there's two routes here. So firstly, you can be awarded leadership points if the target has been officially verified by the Science Based Targets Initiative, or the other way is if the target meets these criteria. So there really needs to be two targets, one with a medium-term time frame, so that's the 2020 and beyond, and one that's longer term, so 2035 and beyond. And again, those targets combined must cover at least 70% of your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and they must meet at least a 2.1% decrease year on year on average. So it is possible to receive full points for this section without yet having an approved science-based target. One other relatively minor change: if you disclose that you don't have risks and you don't recognize risks and opportunities related to physical, regulatory, or reputational climate drivers, you must provide a company-specific explanation of why that's the case. So that's just a slight addition to the scoring criteria for that no route there. And this is a more significant change. So this is 12.1a. It's quite heavily weighted in the scoring. It's where you disclose if you have emissions reductions through emission reduction activities. And at the leadership level, criteria has been added for up to 1 additional point. So if over 4% of your emissions have been reduced as a result of emission reduction activities, you'd be awarded half a point. You'd be awarded a full point, and if the proportion is 2.1%, then you'd be awarded half a point there. So basically an additional leadership point up for grabs for meeting that emission reduction threshold, because CDP wants to continue to drive year-on-year emissions reductions. So when it comes to 2018, CDP is really striving to lead the evolution on environmental disclosure following the Paris Agreement. We want to make sure that we continue to ask the right questions to ensure the data we collect and analyze for investors and companies is meaningful. And at the same time, we recognize it takes a lot of effort for companies to collect the data and synthesize this into reports. We want to really optimize this reporting and streamline the approach. And we want to ensure a better understanding of risks and opportunities across our programs, both now but also looking into the future. So I mentioned before the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. This was created by the Financial Stability Board led by Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg, and CDP is committed to aligning with their recommendations. And we think that they've been very successful in identifying what type of information, in terms of climate information, should be integrated into mainstream reports, but it's not been successful in identifying how to do this. And this is where CDP can step in to provide organizations with this prescription really on how to align with the TCFD recommendations, being able to integrate climate-related information into their mainstream filings and supporting the Paris Agreement below a 2-degree world. So with this in mind, our Reimagining project will evolve our questionnaires, building on our years of experience with three central pillars. The first is sectors, focusing on high-impact sectors. The second is adopting the TCFD recommendations. And thirdly, to continue our evolution and to increase our forward-looking metrics. So that's where the integration of scenario analysis comes in. In terms of the sectors, we will deliver sector-specific sets of questions and scoring across climate, water and forests, as well as common questions for all other sectors. And of course, we will adopt the recommendations from the TCFD that will be launched in July of this year. So we want to take what we've learned from the last 15 years and use this to deliver more impactful disclosures and assessment that investors can use to fulfill CDP's mission of integrating environmental stewardship into the economic system. So we're going to do this by building on the foundations of our climate, water and forest questionnaires and consider the most appropriate sector metrics from other frameworks and industry bodies. So, that would include aligning with GRI, DJSI, SASB, CEO Water Mandate, IIGCC, and so on. And to make sure that the questions we present are the most relevant and material for each sector. We will continue to have separate questionnaires for each theme, so for climate, water, and forest, but they will be, we will have sector metrics within those. And we are focusing on the highest impact sectors. So these sectors to launch in 2018 are in clusters of energy, transport, materials, agriculture and land use, and then a general one. So any sectors not included in those high impact sectors, companies not included in those high impact sectors will be given the regular climate, water and forest questionnaires. And we will have sector-specific scorings as well. So an A in the chemicals industry will not be the same as an A in the FBT, for example. And we'll be adding more sectors to these sets of questions for the 2019 disclosure period. And these are some of the ones that have been proposed. So in terms of the principles for how we decide on the new disclosures and data points for 2018, we really want, we think the disclosures should provide the most impact for investors and record and show progress on the sector's biggest environmental impacts. So these are a few of our guiding principles. You can see here, alignment is key. I mentioned that before. Integration, so making sure that whenever we have similar questions across the questionnaires, they are in the same format with the same language. And then obviously the introduction of scenario analysis. The TCFD recommends different levels of scenario analysis depending on the level of climate exposure, and CDP will be providing guidance on this. And we really want you to help reimagine with us. We're going out to consultation twice this year. The first one is already open, and you have the chance to help us shape and optimize our questionnaires and prioritize the data points that we should include, as well as the ones that we should take out. So we really do encourage you to give us your feedback at this time. If that's not possible, we will be doing a second consultation later in the year, once we actually have draft questionnaires for each sector. And you can feedback on your thoughts on those proposals. And then the sector questionnaires will be launched for the 2018 disclosure cycle. So yeah, your feedback is most welcome. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand back to you, David.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah, for taking us through that and taking us through the 2017 changes, giving us a reminder of what to look for in this year's questionnaire. And then looking forward to next year and what CDP are doing and who they're working with to shape the future of disclosure. That's been really, really helpful. What I'll do just to wrap up at the end of the session in the last few minutes is go through a few tips on responding to CDP. Just as a bit of background to Greenstone, we're a CDP software partner, so we provide software solutions to companies to help them manage all of their data, and CDP is a key driver for a lot of organizations to get a better handle on their data and initiatives and manage that within a platform to respond to CDP each year. So the tips that we'll go through just here on the screen now, and we'll go through each one of these in turn and just have a little look at each one. So the first one is around boundaries. So it's really important that you understand your boundaries, and that's a broader thing for reporting within the non-financial reporting space more generally. and understanding what's within scope and what's out of scope. Within CDP boundaries, what you can have a look at is which you fall into. So whether you're going to take a financial control, an operational control, or an equity share approach to when you report. The diagram here is just an example from the GRI G4 framework to visualize looking at different types of boundaries. So it's something important to look at up front, because really that boundary definition should inform the data that you then collect going forward to be able to respond to CDP. So it's something to look at right up front. The second tip, and that's something that we found that's really important for companies when setting targets and science-based targets, is to get help on those and understand exactly how to set those targets. So, as Sarah mentioned, you can get full points within the CDP disclosure without getting them officially signed off through the Science-Based Targets Initiative. But what we found with clients that have done that, it's been a really valuable process for them. And the science-based target setting process more broadly has really been a key sort of internal driver to engage people in the organization in setting targets that are more stretching, but that foundation in science has really been a good way to be able to have conversations with people at, say, board level, for example, about setting targets that are more relevant to the organization. Our third tip's around market-based emissions. So this has been around for a couple of years now, and something that's really important here is getting a good handle on how you're going to disclose about the market-based approach that you've taken. So here in this on this slide, we've just got the examples of different priorities that you would use for using a market-based reporting approach. And so using things like the instruments, energy attribute certificates, for example, going down to using the different types of emissions. So obviously through systems you can automate some of these processes, but what you need to really think about is how you're going to communicate that Scope 2 market-based approach that you've used in a clear way in your CDP disclosure, but also in a wider audience as well. Scope 2 electricity reporting has traditionally been quite simple, sort of consumption, these are the emissions. And so now if you are introducing a market-based set of emissions, you want to make sure that that's a very clear message and that people understand what that means, and that it's because you've made those proactive green procurement decisions to procure electricity from those sources. Our fourth tip is around using the ORS. So that's the online reporting system that CDP use for submitting data. So this is something that's good to familiarize yourself with as early as possible, and to use some of the features in there that can help you. If you have responded from before, then you can look at copying answers from previous years and adapting them to make them relevant for this year's disclosure. Also important to look at cross-referencing to other questions, because that's not scored, and similarly external links. So when you are responding to a question, make sure that you respond as fully as possible to that question within each answer. Another key thing to think about or to keep in mind is when you're responding is to respond in the main text fields provided for your responses rather than the further information fields. That's where the scoring will take place. So that nuanced difference can mean the difference between scoring or not scoring certain points. Similarly on attachments, make sure that you attach those in the right place to the relevant questions within the ORS. And finally, a good tip when you are preparing your response is to score yourself first. So you can do this offline or through software, and you can go through the process of doing a draft scoring of your own response. And doing that yourself or getting somebody else to do that for you is a really valuable way of checking the completeness of your questions before you then load them into the online reporting system. So the final area is also tip is using CDP resources. So Sarah mentioned about some of the Scope 2 guidance that's on their website. There's a wealth of information on the CDP website in terms of methodologies and guidance. Greenstone, we're part of the CDP accredited software program. So we have a partnership with CDP and therefore align our system to enable clients to respond to CDP. There's also a number of other services that they do offer around feedback calls that typically happen in November time, and also looking at CDP reporter services as well. So do keep those things in mind. Great, so that brings us to the end of our webinar today. I'd just like to thank everybody for coming along. We've had a number of questions that have come through, so what we'll do, we'll respond to people individually with the responses. It looks like some of them are company-specific questions, which is absolutely fine. So please send those through. Please do send them through afterwards as well, and we can respond directly. And then for any broad generic questions, as I say, we'll put together an FAQ document and circulate that as relevant. If anybody would like to know more obviously about Greenstone and how we help clients with getting data that talks to you to feed into CDP reporting, but also wider non-financial reporting, then please do drop us a note as well. I'd just like to thank Sarah for coming along today and taking us through the CDP changes and the future of CDP so clearly and eloquently in our half-an-hour session. So thank you to Sarah. And yes, if you do know people that will be interested in a recording of today's webinar, then again, please do get in touch, and we're very happy to share the content.
Thank you, David.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.